Okay, well, good morning to everybody this morning, and once again I'd like to thank Samuel for inviting me. I've got 45 minutes roughly, I think, in this first session. 3 sessions on Eastern Christianity. It's a whole culture and civilization lasting more than 2,000 years. So I can only just sort of skim the surface in these 3 lectures that I'm going to give you today, but hopefully it'll stimulate you to go on to want to know more and to study more and to read more. So where to begin? Where to begin? Well, let's begin here, because this is the center of the Eastern Christian world, or was the center of the Eastern Christian world. Constantinople, of course, Istanbul today, because since 1453 the city of Constantinople was renamed Istanbul when the Ottoman Turks took the city of Constantinople in 1453. So if you go to Istanbul today, what you see is the sort of pictures I'm showing at the moment, is it seems all to be Muslim and Islamic. This is because since the 15th century it has been dominated by Islam and by Islamic buildings. But of course there are many Christian buildings in Istanbul. One of the most famous is the great church of Hagia Sophia, Divine Wisdom. You have to try to imagine this great church, which you can visit today if any of you have been to Istanbul, and try to imagine it without the minarets, because this, during the Ottoman period to the early 20th century, from the 15th through to the early 20th century, this was used as a mosque, as many churches of the Byzantine churches in Constantinople were used as mosques during the Ottoman period. So you have to imagine it without the minarets. There are additions from the later period. It's called Divine Wisdom. It's a very unusual title, and there are no churches in the Western tradition dedicated to divine wisdom. It is an Eastern tradition, and this is the mother church of the Eastern Orthodox, the Byzantine tradition, as you'll see in a minute. So it's called Divine Wisdom, and it refers to Christ. It's a title given to Christ in the Greek-speaking world, Divine Wisdom, Hagia Sophia. But it's not a Western tradition, it's very much an Eastern tradition. There are many churches dedicated to divine wisdom in the East. This church that you're looking at, and when you visit it in Istanbul today, is basically a 6th century structure. From the time of the Emperor Justinian in the middle of the 6th century, this is this great church. There was originally a 1st, 4th century church which was started by Constantine the Great. And so there were 2 churches called Holy Wisdom before you see this one, because the previous 2 were destroyed in various fires. And in the 6th century there was a great fire in Constantinople, and as a result of that Justinian rebuilt this great church on this huge monument. You can see the interior of it here, and maybe some of you have visited it, and you can stand in the middle of this great dome. It is one of the largest domes from the ancient world. And it's a great tribute to Byzantine, late Roman engineering and architecture, and still stands very much as you would have seen it in the 6th century. The dome collapsed in the 9th century during an earthquake, but was rebuilt, so it's still very much the structure back to the 6th century. But as I say, if you get off the beaten track in Istanbul, you can see many monuments going right back into the 4th and 5th centuries. The great walls of Theodosius on the land walls on the left slide that I'm showing you. The Viaduct of Valens, the Emperor Valens from the 4th century. This used to bring water into this great city. And Constantinople, of course, did become the largest city in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it was much bigger at Rome in its heyday in the 6th century and a little bit after that. And as I say, if you can get off the beaten track, and you can find many Byzantine churches tucked away in the back streets of Istanbul, of Constantinople. You're looking at some later Byzantine churches from the 13th and 14th centuries. Notice the dome, this central dome that dominates Eastern Christian church architecture. It's very much what you expect to see in an Eastern Christian context. So if you haven't been to Istanbul, to Constantinople, then it's always worth a visit, because there's much to see. Okay, a little bit of Byzantine History. So the city of Byzantium was an ancient city going back to the 7th century BCE. During the 3rd century, it was rebuilt by a Roman emperor, as you can see. Severus began rebuilding. But in the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine the Great rededicated this city, and it was known thereafter as Constantinople, the city of Constantine the Great, in 330. And it was subsequently then known as the New Rome, as a distinction from the Old Rome in Italy. And as I said already, in 1453, it was renamed Istanbul under the Ottomans. The word Istanbul, by the way, is a Turkish equivalent of the Greek, meaning to the city. Everybody in the ancient Byzantine world, if you said, I'm going to the smoke, I'm going to the city, everybody knew where you were going to. You were going to Constantinople. So everybody referred to it as the city, and that's what it means in Turkish today as well. So the title has continued actually in a Turkish Ottoman period. And Byzantine, or Byzantine, is the name that we give to this particular empire and its civilization and its citizens. But it's a modern construct, because none of those people who lived in the Byzantine Empire, as we call it today, referred to themselves as Byzantines or Byzantines. They always referred to themselves as Romans, because they saw themselves very much as inheriting the Roman world. There was a shift to the east, to Constantinople, to the New Rome, and so the citizens of Constantinople, of Byzantium, referred to themselves as Romans. They used Roman law, they used Roman architecture, Roman engineering, and so on. They were the great inheritors, or saw themselves in the east as the inheritors of the Roman world. And they were known to the Arabs as Rum, as they still are today. Christians in the Middle East are referred to in Arabic as Rum, and it comes from this identity by Eastern Christians in the Byzantine Empire as calling themselves Romans. So remember that the notion of a Byzantine Empire is largely an 18th century modern construct. Now let's just look at some history to do with early Constantinople and Byzantium. We have what is called the First Byzantine Commonwealth, which began under Justinian, the great emperor, in the 6th century and takes us through to about the 9th century. I'll show you a map in a minute because it incorporates much of the Eastern Mediterranean. Let's perhaps just look at that map first. Here's the empire, the Byzantine Empire, under the Emperor Justinian in the middle of the 6th century. And you can see quite clearly all of the Eastern Mediterranean, what we call Asia Minor or Turkey, Egypt, North Africa, southern Spain and Italy were part of Justinian's reconquest in the 6th century. So this was all incorporated into the Eastern Roman Empire, the so-called Byzantine Empire, based at Constantinople. So Constantinople was the center of this Eastern Roman Empire, where these Christian citizens referred to themselves as Romans. So this first Byzantine Commonwealth, established by Justinian in the 6th century, incorporates all of this Eastern Mediterranean, North African Christianity in this area. There was Persian control of the Eastern Mediterranean in the early 7th century, which came as rather a shock to the Byzantine army. But this was nothing compared with the Arab invasions a little bit later on. So by the middle of the 7th century, the Eastern Mediterranean picture is changed because of all of this area that you can see in the middle of the 6th century has been taken over by the Arabs. Let me just go back one more. In the 8th and 9th centuries, we have a period of iconoclasm, which I hope to say something about in a minute. And then in the 9th century, we have what's called the mission of Cyril and Methodius. These were two apostles, Byzantine apostles from Thessaloniki in northern Greece, who then took Byzantine Christianity into the Balkans, and subsequently this had a flowering of Christianity into Russia by the 10th and the 11th century, and the establishment of what we call a second Byzantine Commonwealth. So there's Justinian's empire in the middle of the 6th century. Justinian and Theodora, these very famous emperor and his empress. You can see them in some 6th century mosaics from Ravenna. Maybe some of you have visited Ravenna, another wonderful city full of Byzantine churches and architecture, and 2 very important mosaics. Done from life, left Justinian, and on the right his Empress Theodora, 2 very famous names in Byzantine history. So this first Byzantine Commonwealth, I showed you that map of the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. Now, Greek was the lingua franca of the Byzantine Empire. But that didn't mean to say that everybody was an ethnic Greek, far from it. It was a much more cosmopolitan empire, with many people coming from North Africa, from Egypt, from Syria, from Palestine, from Armenia to Constantinople to study, and so on. It's Greek-speaking, Greek is the lingua franca, but it doesn't mean that everybody's ethnically Greek, far from it. It's like English today. Lots of people speak English in the world today, but it doesn't make you ethnically English because you speak that language. But Greek is the dominant language in terms of communication. But there are many indigenous languages. So if you were going to Egypt in the 6th century, you would hear Coptic being spoken. If you went to Syria, you would hear Syriac, in Palestine, Syriac as well. If you went to the Caucasus area, you'd hear Armenian and Georgian, and so on. So there are lots of local languages within this first Byzantine Commonwealth. And these are all, very interestingly, Christian languages. Coptic, which began more or less in the 4th century and through the 5th and so on, is a language which was a means of communication for Christianity. In the Caucasus area, Armenian and Georgian are early 5th century written languages. And they came in with Christianity. In other words, these languages have a close identity with Christianity. So you have a very interesting sort of package of a local language, like Armenian, for example. Armenian was never a written language before Armenia became Christian in the 4th century, and we have an Armenian language from the early 5th century. It's the same with Georgian. There's a close package to do with religion, language, ethnicity, and culture, a very close package. So most Armenians today, if you tap them on the shoulder and say, "You're a Christian, aren't you?" they'll say, "Yes, of course I am." And they identify very closely with our Armenian Christian tradition, whether they're nationalists, even in the communist period as well. They consider themselves to be Christian. So there's a strong identity. It's like Coptic Christians having that sense of their Christianity, their Coptic language and ancient language. So what we get is a diversity of languages in the East, which if you contrast it with the West and what the church was doing in the West, it was making Latin the dominant ecclesiastical language. Wherever Rome was influential in the West, then it used Latin as its means of communication, its church language, its liturgy, and so on. In the East, there's a much more diversity of languages and ethnicity. So we get a much more complicated sort of situation. And Christianity, of course, was supposed to be, from the time of Constantine the Great, the uniting religion that was to unite everybody under the late Roman and the Eastern Roman Empire. It did nothing of the sort, of course. Christianity, perhaps for about the middle of the 4th century to the middle of the 5th century, just about managed to keep its act together in terms of all united under one church. But by the early 5th century, as we'll see, it started to disintegrate into different churches. So we have these divisions in the church beginning. But one of the most monumentous events in the history of Eastern Christianity, in the Eastern Mediterranean generally, is the Arab conquests in the middle of the 7th century. So if you look at this map, you can see exactly what's happened. By this period, all of this Eastern Mediterranean area, which had been Christian, whether it was in Palestine, Syria, the Caucasus area, North Africa, Egypt, and so on, has now been taken over by the Arabs. So it's now subsumed, these Christian countries, right, have been now subsumed into the Arab caliphate. except, as you can see on the map to the north, you can see what is basically Turkey today, Asia Minor, and the Balkans area remained in Byzantine control. But this is a great event. It changes overnight the political, social, and cultural understanding of people in the Eastern Mediterranean. The biggest event in this middle of the 7th century that changes the perspective and understanding of people living in this part of the Eastern Mediterranean. Nevertheless, the Byzantine Empire held on to its identity, as you can see, from the middle of the 7th century through to the middle of the 9th century. And notice it goes east, that the Arab Caliphate has gone right through Persia. The Sasanian, Iranian, Persian Empire has also been destroyed by the Arabs. So two great civilizations, the Persian, Iranian, Sasanian Empire in the east, and the Byzantine, Eastern Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. In a twinkling of an eye, almost historically, the whole situation has changed. Just very quickly, because I'll come back to this in the second lecture, I think, just to look at it for you in terms of the history. The death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, the Arab conquests of Damascus, you can see their dates there. The most important battle as far as the Byzantines was concerned was the Battle of Yarmouk, which is in Jordan today, in a wadi in Jordan. You can still visit it. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 saw the total routing of the Byzantine army by the Arabs, completely destroyed. This is a very important battle. The first Arab caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate as it's called, was not based in south, in Arabia, was based in Damascus. So from the middle of the 7th century to 750, that's the middle of the 8th century, the early Arab Caliphate was based in Damascus, right? Not in Arabia, but in Damascus. And very interestingly, Greek continued to be the administrative language of the early Arab Caliphate. Now, the Arabs had come up from the south. They were a nomadic people. They didn't have a lot of history of settled civilization, of building monuments and so on, as we'll see later on. But they were very clever also, because they realized that if they took away the administrative structure, which had been established by the Byzantines, of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the whole thing would collapse. So everybody got on doing their jobs as administrators and civil servants using Greek, not Arabic. So Greek is used to continue this administration of the early Arab Caliphate through to about 715, when Arabic then is used as the administrative language. So there's some continuity with the Byzantine Greek administration through into the early 8th century, as you can see. The city of Constantinople was under siege. In 717, the Arabs tried to take the city of Constantinople in 717, but they were never able to do this. They tried on 3 occasions to take Constantinople, but they were always unsuccessful. So Constantinople always remained. And then there was an Abbasid caliphate from Baghdad from the middle of the 8th century. But we'll come back to this a little bit later. Now, I mentioned there was an iconoclastic period in the 8th and 9th centuries in Byzantium. This is a rather interesting episode in Byzantine history. Maybe some of you have heard of it, I'm not sure. But what it meant was that the Byzantine emperors, and I gave you a list of emperors, don't worry too much about the names and dates, but they imposed iconoclasm. That is, they said to the Eastern Christians of the Byzantine Empire, you should not venerate icons. And in the 8th and 9th centuries, there are 2 movements against the use of icons and their veneration in the East. It's very interesting because if you compare it with what happened in the Reformation and what some of the reformers were saying, some of the arguments that are used by the iconoclasts are almost identical to some of the arguments used by the reformers later on. But very interestingly, the reformers didn't know about this period of iconoclasm in Byzantium. They were ignorant of it. They didn't know about it. And yet, later on, we find the 15th and 16th century Western Christians coming up with very similar arguments for not using icons, for not venerating icons, as happened in Byzantium in the 8th and 9th centuries. This iconoclastic period is imposed upon the church by the emperors, right? And maybe it's no coincidence that this issue that's happened in the 7th century with the Arab invasions of the Eastern Mediterranean, that perhaps we get some sort of reaction in Byzantium in the 8th and 9th centuries. It's a very murky sort of area. We don't know all the answers to why there was an iconoclastic period in the 8th and 9th centuries. But having gone through this period through to the middle of the 9th century, Byzantium then always used icons and subsequently influenced the rest of the Eastern Orthodox world in the veneration of icons. Once they'd gone through this period in the 8th and 9th centuries, that seemed to clear the air. They knew what they were doing with these icons, why they venerated them, and so on. But there's some interesting parallels historically there with later events. We've got a couple of very interesting illustrations from a 9th century Greek manuscript showing the iconoclasts at work here, and it shows you at the bottom left you can see an iconoclast. I've brought it up for you and enlarged it on the right. What he's doing is taking a mop with some whitewash, and he's going to whitewash out and get rid of the icon of Christ. So he dips it into his urn and then tries to get rid of it, you see? And these are little margin illustrations in a 9th century manuscript illustrating this period of iconoclasm in Byzantium in this period. Well, what about icons? Icons are very important in the Eastern Christian traditions, in all of the traditions, in some more than others. But we'll say that perhaps a little bit later. I'm sure this icon is familiar to you. It's perhaps, anybody ever not seen this particular icon before? Yes or no? Okay, it's just one that is reproduced again and again in many books, whether it's coming from a Protestant, Catholic or Orthodox tradition. And of course, icons have been introduced into many churches today where you wouldn't have seen them sort of 30 or 40 years ago, but you do see them more. And this is a very famous one. It's a 6th century icon from the monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt. There aren't many pre-iconoclastic icons that survived that iconoclastic period in the 8th and 9th centuries because many were destroyed. But some of the most famous are these icons from St. Catherine's Monastery. They use what's called an encaustic technique. It's the use of hot wax. When you look at it, you think, wow, that's a fantastic sort of image. But you're probably not familiar with the technique for actually painting it. It's not obviously oil paint or anything like that. It's what's called encaustic. And what you have to do, you have to heat your wax, your colored wax, and you have to apply it to your panel while it's still liquid, right? It's an ancient technique. The Romans used it. You find it in the ancient Hellenistic world as well. It's come right through to this period about the 8th and 9th centuries. After that, icons use a new technique called tempera, but these earlier icons are painted in the encaustic technique. One famous defender, an iconophile, of the icons was somebody called John of Damascus, a famous father of the church. And John, very interestingly, was what we would call today an Arab Christian in the late 7th and to the middle of the 8th century. He was a monk in this famous monastery of Sabas in Palestine. You can still visit this monastery. It's still a monastery, a Greek monastery that runs right through today. And John of Damascus wrote 3 little books on the defense of icons. Maybe some of you have seen them, I'm not sure, but they're worth reading. You can find them, they're in English, and it gives you really for the first time why a Christian is saying that we should have images of Christ and Mary and the saints, and more importantly, why we should venerate them. Very interesting text. For the first time, somebody had to sit down and defend the use of icons because of this iconoclastic period. So John of Damascus is a famous defender of icons. Let's just see what he says, just to sort of give you a flavor for this. He says, "Should I not make an image of the one who appeared for my sake in the nature of flesh? and venerate and honor him with the honor and veneration. There's a particular Greek word that's used, this proskinesis, offered to his image. And should I not make images of the friends of Christ, that is, the saints and his mother? And should I not venerate them not as gods, but as images of God's friends? So he has a particular way that he looks at the use of icons, which is not that he's going to accept that he's worshipping an idol, not a bit of it. He's going to define what he means by an icon, and he's going to define what he means by veneration. So he's using different vocabulary here to say what it is that Christians do. Another of these iconophiles was somebody called Theodore the Studite. He came from the Studious Monastery in Constantinople. The image on the right is what you can see of that famous 6th century monastery still in Istanbul today. It's a famous Byzantine monastery, huge monastery, and under Theodore the Studite there were about 4,000 monks. He was a great charismatic figure who attracted a lot of monastics to his tradition. And he's in the early 9th century also wrote a defense of icons and images. And let's see what he says. If anyone should transfer the scriptural prohibitions of idols and misapply them to the holy icon of Christ, so as to miscall his church a temple of idols, he's a heretic, right? He's having a go at the iconoclasts because he thinks they're heretics. If anyone should say that when the image of Christ is displayed, it is sufficient neither to honor nor dishonor it, thus refusing it the honor of relative veneration, all right? And he uses this word proskinesis again. He is a heretic. So he's trying again to make sure that we understand what it is we're doing when we look at an icon and when we venerate that icon. Maybe we light candles before it and so on. I'm putting all of this across to you because there's a lot of misunderstanding about icons and their veneration in the Eastern Christian tradition. All right? And this is a very important episode that you can look back on and perhaps wrestle with it a little bit more, perhaps, than in the way that we are not accustomed to thinking about it. Okay, so we've gone through this period, 6th century, 7th century Arab invasions, 8th and 9th centuries. We've had this rather introspective, inward-looking controversy of iconoclasm in Byzantium, particularly in Constantinople. But from after iconoclasm, from the middle of the 9th century, we get a sort of renewed vigor in Constantinople and a looking more outwardly. And what happened here is that we have the establishment of what we call the Second Byzantine Commonwealth. And it happens to the Balkans, to the north of Constantinople. You can see Constantinople on your map. So if you look at Bulgaria, Pannonia, you can see the Western Slavs around the Black Sea, the Principality of Rus. This is the name of Russia, of what we call Russia, Rus. What happened from the middle of the second half of the 9th century was an interest in these Slavonic-speaking people to the north. These people were nomadic people who come into the Balkans during the 6th, 7th century and settled in this area, and were interested in Byzantine civilization, but they were also interested in Roman, that is, in the Roman tradition of Christianity, the Latin tradition of Christianity. And in Bulgaria, for example, in the 9th century, the Khan, the king of the Bulgars, he played off one against the other. He played Constantinople off against Rome. And eventually he decided that he would go with Constantinople and that his people would become Byzantine, Orthodox Christians. But for a while it was touch and go which way it was going to go. So two famous apostles to the Slavs in the second half of the 9th century, Cyril and Methodius. The name Cyrillic for the alphabet comes from Cyril's name, all right? So Cyril and Methodius were these first apostles, and they went to Moravia, which maybe I've got a map. No, I haven't got a map to show where ancient Moravia is, but it's in Central Europe, taking up parts of Hungary and Slovakia today. And this is where they first went, because the king of Moravia at that point asked the Byzantine emperor and patriarch to send some Christians to teach them about Christianity. So Cyril and Methodius went, but before they went, they invented this new alphabet. It's the earliest one is called the Glagolitic, but subsequently we have the Cyrillic alphabets. This is a great revolution because it brings Christianity to the Slavonic speaking people for the first time, and with it, once again, their written alphabet. So Christianity has that very strong identity once again in the East, with your nationality, your religion, your nationality, your language and so on, are very tightly connected. Perhaps in a way, for many Westerners, they're not used to that sort of relationship. We tend to separate our culture from our religion, our state from our church and so on. This is not the case traditionally in the East. So Cyril and Methodius, the apostles to the Slavs, began this mission to the Balkans. What was very interesting about this was the sort of knock-on effect. Here's Cyril and Methodius. You can see their icon on the left here. And here's a processional icon of Cyril and Methodius on their feast day. I think this one has been taking place in Russia. Very important to the Slavonic-speaking churches, Cyril and Methodius and their legacy here. So we've got this second Byzantine Commonwealth from the middle of the 9th century. So as I say, Slavonic-speaking lands to the north came under Byzantine influence. So what it means is they're not only getting Christianity, that is Byzantine Christianity based at Constantinople, but they're getting a whole package, right? They're getting a liturgy. They're getting their art and their architecture. They're also getting political influence. So it's a package. Don't think of it mission in this period as simply converting people to Christianity. It's not only Christianity that they're getting a whole civilization. It's a package that the Byzantines are giving to them. And they're going along with this, they want that. So Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, then early in the 10th century, we hear about Christian activity that is from Constantinople in Ukraine and the Crimea, and eventually to the north into Rus, into Russia. This is absorbed into the late 10th, 11th century. These people have also converted to Byzantine Christianity. So you can see that the influence of Constantinople is now in the Balkans and to the Eastern Europe and to Russia. It's lost its influence in the east, the Mediterranean and North Africa, as a result of the Arab invasions in the middle of the 7th century. Now it has a new sort of revigorated sense of identity to the north and amongst the Slavonic speaking peoples. What about the Byzantine Church? Well, Constantine the Great, of course, becomes the ideal Christian emperor. In the Byzantine tradition, he's known as equal with the apostles. He's very much pushed by Eusebius, the great church historian, as fulfilling a great destiny of divine providence. He's the emperor who comes, gives freedom of worship to the Christians, and ultimately bestows upon the state, the Roman state, Christianity. So the Pax Romana and the Pax Christiana converge in the Byzantine state. From about the start of this middle of the 4th century, time of Constantine the Great onwards, there's this great sense of the church and state, that is the Roman peace and the church, the peace of the church, strong identity together. They should work together to promote Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire, which began in the late 4th century. And there's this sense of continuity with the Roman world, with the Roman emperors, the notion of apotheosis, that is the deification of the Roman emperors, and the saintly Christian emperor. There's a sort of transference. So these Christian emperors now are exalted. They stand next to God. They're very, very exalted individuals. And they can't really do any wrong, you see, because they're very close to God. And they're governing on behalf of Christ. They're sort of seen very much as his representative. A strong identity between church and state here. And Justinian's law in the 6th century, he speaks of a symphonia between church and state. He sees them working together in close cooperation to bring about divine providence, or however you want to describe it. So it's a quite strong sense of theocracy, right? It's the emperor together with the bishop or patriarch of Constantinople working together on behalf of the Christian state. It's that very close identity. And of course it raises the question of what we call, from a Western point of view, Caesaropapism and the issues involved with that. And notice too that the emperors convoke the ecumenical councils. From the time of Constantine the Great in the 4th century, all the ecumenical councils, we'll see again in a minute, are convoked or called by emperors. So there's a strong involvement of the state in church affairs. In this early period, going through late 4th century, 5th century onwards, we have what is called the Pentarchy. And it shows you the relationship between Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. These are considered to be the ancient sees of the early church. But Constantinople has a bit of a problem with this, because it was difficult to try to show that Constantinople was an apostolic see, all right? Because it wasn't. But they reinvented the wheel, as most people do, and they came up with St. Andrew had been there and so on. But this takes a bit of time to come through and to develop. But there is a sense in this period from the late 4th century of close cooperation between, as you can see, the 5 great ancient patriarchs here of Rome, Constantinople, working together on behalf of the church. So this Pentarchy, well, it's very interesting because Rome is referred to, of course, as first among equals. Whatever you can interpret that to mean, I'm not sure, but that's the phrase that was used. So there's a sense that Rome has something, but it's equal amongst the other 4. The 5 work together here. Constantinople, of course, is calling itself the New Rome, and certainly by the, as I say, the late 4th century, it sees itself very much as the New Rome and places itself after Rome in the pecking order. There's a sort of pecking order beginning to emerge here. But of course all of this sort of goes out of the window with the Arab invasions in the 7th century, because Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in this period in Syria, and Jerusalem of course in Palestine is absorbed into the Arab caliphate. So it loses, these 3 ancient sees lose their influence in Christendom, right? They're now becoming churches isolated from Constantinople, the Byzantine Church in Constantinople, and of course the Latin Church in Rome. So they pushed out of the picture to some extent historically. What this means is that the Constantinople becomes dominant in the East, and of course Rome does the same in the West. So these two, there's a tension then builds up between Rome and Constantinople. And this tension results, in fact, in a schism between the 2 churches, which I'll mention in a minute. Let's look just very quickly at what are called the 7 Ecumenical Councils. Here they are: Nicaea 1, Constantinople 1, Ephesus, Chalcedon, Constantinople 2, Constantinople 3, Nicaea 2. All of these councils are accepted by East and West, that is by the Catholic Latin tradition and by the Byzantine Greek tradition, as being ecumenical. Those 2 churches. Read my lips, just those 2 churches, all right? Recognize that. Subsequently, of course, in the West, with the Reformation and Protestants recognized, or to begin with, really only recognized up to Chalcedon. They made sort of arbitrary decisions about which councils they thought were okay and which weren't. It's rather a dubious sort of thing, but we can talk about that. Okay, 7 Ecumenical Councils. What is very interesting is you look at it historically and geographically. They all take place in the East. Not one of those ecumenical councils takes place in the West. Right? What it means is that the emperor in Constantinople doesn't want to travel to Rome, for example, to have an ecumenical council. No, he just wants to cross over the Bosphorus. He wants to go to Chalcedon. It's just a boat ride across to go to Chalcedon. Or he might take a 2-day journey to Nicaea, which is in Turkey today, or he might go a little bit further by boat to Ephesus. But that's about as much as he's going to manage, all right? What it shows you too is this is where the power lies. It lies in the east with the emperor in Constantinople. He's dictating where these ecumenical councils are going to happen. So the Pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, the Patriarch of Rome, he has to either travel to the east or send his legates as representatives to the east. You should always bear in this mind, these 7 councils all take place in the east, and it's because that's where the imperial authority and power lay. You do what the emperor dictates here. Now, very quickly over these church councils, the main turning point is the Council of Chalcedon in 451, because this separates Constantinople and Rome from these other Christian traditions, which subsequently are known as the Coptic Orthodox, the Syrian Orthodox, and the Armenian Orthodox churches, because these churches don't recognize Chalcedon as an ecumenical council. It's a turning point in the history and divisions of the church. In the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian tries several times to reunite these churches, to bring them back in, all right? But he fails to do this in the middle of the 6th century. Again, there's an emperor in the early 7th century, Heraclius. He again tries to reunite the churches because the emperors are very concerned that they keep this empire together, that it's a united Christian empire. And they're not able to do this if there's dissent in the church, if there are breakaway churches, whichever perspective you look at it from. So the Copts, the Syrians, the Armenians and others need to be brought back into the church. But these are failed attempts. They don't manage to do this. So what happens from this late 6th century, 7th century onwards is we get 2 patriarch system. So in Alexandria, for example, you have a Byzantine Greek patriarch, but you also have a Coptic patriarch. In Antioch, you've got also a Greek patriarch, Byzantine patriarch, but a Syrian patriarch, and so on. It creates divisions and double patriarchates here. And of course, what's happened here, as you've seen, is that the Arab conquests isolate these Eastern Oriental churches, and they become people of the book under Islam. That's what they're called, under Islam. And then, of course, this continuing tension between Constantinople and Rome erupts in 1054 with a mutual condemnation of Rome and Constantinople. So we then get a further, in the middle of the 11th century, division in the churches. So we haven't had a very happy sort of church history right through from the 5th century, the divisions in the east, and by the 11th century, even Constantinople and Rome are divided and they're not accepting each other and who they stand for and so on. Just to give you an idea from this map, the sort of divisions that you can see around this point between the Holy Roman Empire it's become in the east and the Byzantine Empire. Some points of difference, mainly between the Latins and the Greeks here after the 11th century. Of course, the Byzantine churches will not accept the notion of Roman primacy, which has been pushed always, of course, by the popes in Rome. And there are questions, this is a very debatable question, as you've seen, about Rome being first amongst equals. There is a recognition somewhere that Rome has some special status, but none of the Eastern Patriarchs are going to allow it to have primacy over them. The Filioque, the addition of the "and from the Son" in the Creed, which began to be inserted in the Latin creed from the early 9th century onwards, but didn't really become a dogma until about the 11th century. The West wasn't sure about that. The use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist by the West. The East has always used leavened bread, so there was a debate about that. The notion of celibacy in the Latin Catholic tradition. There were always married priests in the Eastern tradition, and there still are today. There's married and unmarried, so if you get married before you're ordained, you stay married. But once you're ordained, then you don't marry in the Eastern tradition. And many of your hierarchs in the church, or bishops, patriarchs, and so on, of course, celibate. They're monastics and so on. And there are issues over original sin, providence, free will, grace, hell, and purgatory, and so on. A lot of theological debate about that. And of course, ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Rome felt that it should always have control of the Balkans and so on, whereas Constantinople was saying, no, it's our area, get your hands off, mate, and so on. So there are all sorts of issues and problems here, which are still not being resolved, which is all very silly, and here we are in the 21st century, not even being able to talk about these issues for some reason. Don't leave it to the hierarchs, please. Okay, let's just follow this east-west divide, just to get it over to you. Because often this is what's left out of the history books. I mean, Eastern Christianity, even Byzantium, if you go to your local bookstore and you look at your history section and you look at a history of medieval history, first thing you should do is go to the index and see whether it mentions Constantinople or whether it mentions Byzantium. And 6 times out of 10 it won't mention it. It's as if it didn't exist, you know. Byzantium, Constantinople falls right between the Western Eurocentric view of church history or it's the Eastern Islamic world. It just falls in between. For some reason. It doesn't have a very good history for Westerners, for some reason, Byzantium. Anyway, Chalcedon is this turning point for the Eastern Orthodox, the Oriental Orthodox. I'll say more about that division in a minute. So once again, 736, the Arab conquest of Byzantine territory in East, it has a devastating effect on the power and influence and prestige of the emperor in Constantinople. He's lost all that territory in the East. Of course, at 800, a very important event happens in the West with the coronation of Charles the Great, of Charlemagne, and the establishment of the Carolingian Empire. Because one of the things that Charles the Great did was to set himself up deliberately in opposition to the emperor in Constantinople. He was really out to rival the emperor in Constantinople. And of course the emperor in Constantinople didn't like this a bit, and it led to quite a lot of conflict subsequently. But that's what Charles was trying to do at the beginning of the 9th century there. The further division in the 11th century between what we can call now the Eastern Orthodox and Latin Catholic Church divide. A very important event in the 13th century, the Fourth Crusade. What did the Fourth Crusade do? Well, the Fourth Crusade got rather diverted. It never intended, it never set out to take Constantinople and to destroy and kill its co-religionists, its Christians in Constantinople, but that's what happened. So from 1204 to 1261 we have a Latin occupation of Constantinople, which does not go down well in Eastern Christian history, because it is a devastating event. But by 1261 the Byzantines had retaken Constantinople and were back in control, and that was the end of the Latin occupation. It's a very interesting bit of history and period of that. And so Constantinople, Byzantine Empire, goes through to 1453, and then we have the conquest by the Ottoman Turks in 1453 and the taking over of what's left. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire is very diminished because it's being pushed either from the West or it's being pushed by the Ottomans even more. They're taking more and more of Byzantine territory. 1453, of course, is the great turning point. The Byzantines looked to the West for help. They tried to get the West on their side to try to stop the Ottoman advance. But one of the sticking points was always this business about uniting the church. The Pope in Rome and his influence in terms of crusaders and army and so on was, well, okay, we'll come and help you if you reunite with us and you accept blah, blah, blah. But of course the Byzantines wouldn't do this. And anyway, historically, there wasn't much the West could have done militarily to save the situation. So perhaps it ended in the way that it did, the way that it had to do. Okay, I'll finish there.